218 BC, northern Italy, December. The river Trebia is frozen at the edges. The Roman army is camped on the western bank. 40,000 soldiers, the finest fighting force in the Mediterranean world. On the other side of that river, Hannibal Barca, and an army that had just walked over the Alps. In winter, with elephants. Rome had never seen anything like what was coming. And by the time the sun set that day, 29,000 Roman soldiers would be dead. In a single afternoon. To understand what happened at Trebia, you need to understand what Hannibal had already done just to get there. Because the Battle of Trebia didn't start on the banks of a frozen river. It started in Carthage, thousands of miles away, with a 9-year-old boy standing before a sacrificial altar. His name was Hannibal Barca. His father was Hamilcar, the greatest Carthaginian general of his generation, a man who had fought Rome to a standstill in Sicily and never truly accepted the peace that followed. According to ancient sources, young Hannibal begged his father to take him to war. Hamilcar looked at his son and asked him a question. "Do you understand what you're asking for?" "Yes," the boy said. "I want to fight Rome." Hamilcar made him swear an oath at the altar, an oath of eternal enmity toward Rome, an oath that Hannibal would carry with him every day for the rest of his life. He kept it. By 218 BC, Hannibal was 29 years old and in command of the Carthaginian army in Spain. Rome had just declared war on Carthage, the Second Punic War. The Roman plan was simple. Send one army to Spain to deal with Hannibal. Send another army to North Africa to attack Carthage directly. Fight the war on Carthaginian soil, not Roman. Hannibal read the plan perfectly, and he did something so audacious that Rome didn't even consider it possible. He marched to Rome, not by sea, not through Sicily, overland, through southern France, across the Rhone River, through the Alps, in late autumn, approaching winter, with an army of 38,000 infantry, 8,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. The Alps in November are not a hiking trail. They are a killing ground. Snow, altitude sickness, rock slides triggered by hostile mountain tribes, paths so narrow that entire units fell into gorges and simply disappeared. Hannibal lost roughly a third of his army crossing the Alps, and he kept going, because he understood something that Roman strategic planners hadn't considered. The greatest weapon he had was not his army. It was the shock of his arrival. When Hannibal descended from the Alps into the Po Valley in northern Italy, Rome scrambled. The consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, father of the man who would eventually destroy Carthage, rushed north with his army. He had been on his way to Spain when the news arrived that Hannibal was already in Italy. The two forces clashed briefly at the Ticinus River in November. A cavalry skirmish. Rome lost. Scipio himself was nearly killed. Saved, according to one account, by his 17-year-old son. Rome pulled back, called for reinforcements. The second consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, was recalled from Sicily with his army. Now Rome had two consular armies in northern Italy. Combined strength, approximately 40,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry. Hannibal had roughly 20,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry after his losses in the Alps. On paper, Rome had the advantage. But Hannibal didn't fight on paper. Here is where the psychology of this battle becomes extraordinary. Tiberius Sempronius Longus was not a bad general. He was an ambitious one. His term as consul was ending. This was his last chance for military glory before returning to civilian life. He looked at his army, 40,000 soldiers, and at Hannibal's battered force that had just crawled over the Alps. He wanted a fight. Hannibal knew this, and he used it. On a cold December morning, ancient sources say it was the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, Hannibal sent his Numidian cavalry across the Trebia to harass the Roman camp. The Numidians were the finest light cavalry in the ancient world. Fast, aggressive, brilliant horsemen from North Africa. They rode up to the Roman camp, threw javelins, shouted insults, and then galloped away. Sempronius responded exactly as Hannibal had calculated. He ordered the entire army to advance. Immediately, without breakfast, without warming up, without proper reconnaissance. Now picture what that means. It is December in northern Italy. The year is 218 BC. The temperature is near freezing. There has been overnight snow. The Roman soldiers, 40,000 of them, are rousted from their tents before dawn. No time to eat. No time to properly equip. Sempronius is furious and impatient and wants his battle before Hannibal escapes. They march to the Trebia River. The Trebia in December is not a gentle stream. It is a fast-moving, chest-deep, ice-cold river fed by alpine snowmelt. The Roman army wades across. 40,000 men, chest-deep in freezing water. In December, before breakfast, carrying full armor and weapons. By the time they reach the other bank, the Roman soldiers are soaked to the skin, shaking with cold, their fingers barely able to grip their weapons, their muscles cramping in the freezing temperature. And Hannibal's army is waiting for them. Federal warm, rested. Hannibal had ordered his men to eat a full breakfast, oil their bodies against the cold, and warm themselves at fires before the battle. He had prepared his army for exactly this morning. The battle began in earnest as the Roman infantry formed up on the freezing bank. Hannibal's formation was deceptively straightforward. In the center, his weakest infantry, mostly Spanish and Gallic warriors, brave, fierce fighters, but not the elite of his army. Hannibal placed them in the center deliberately. They were bait. On the flanks, his best cavalry. 10,000 horsemen against Rome's 4,000. Numerical superiority so overwhelming it wasn't even a contest. Hidden in the riverbed vegetation along the Trebia's banks, a strike force of 2,000 soldiers, infantry and cavalry mixed, commanded by his younger brother Mago. They had been there since before dawn, lying in the freezing reed beds, waiting. The Roman battle plan was what it always was. Advance the infantry, push through the center, win. It was a plan that had worked against every enemy Rome had ever faced. It had never faced Hannibal. The battle opened with the skirmishers, light infantry and javelin throwers on both sides. The Romans were already exhausted and cold. Their throwing arms were stiff. Their accuracy was suffering. Hannibal's war elephants were deployed on the flanks. The Romans had faced elephants before. Barely, but never in these numbers, never in this cold, never when they were already exhausted before the fighting started. The elephants terrified the Roman allied cavalry on the flanks. The allied horsemen, non-Roman troops fighting alongside the legions, broke almost immediately. Then Hannibal's cavalry hit Rome's 4,000 horsemen. The numbers were simply too unequal. Rome's cavalry was swept from the field in minutes. Both flanks gone. Just like that. But the Roman legionary infantry in the center was still fighting. And fighting well. This is the extraordinary thing about the Roman soldier. Even exhausted, even freezing, even with both flanks collapsed around them, the legions pushed forward. Discipline and training overriding everything else. They actually began pushing back Hannibal's weaker center. For a brief moment, just a moment, it looked like Rome might somehow survive this. Then Mago struck. 2,000 Carthaginian soldiers exploding out of the riverbed vegetation directly into the Roman rear. The army that had been pushing forward suddenly had enemies in front of them, enemies behind them, cavalry closing in from both sides. The encirclement was complete. What followed was not a battle. It was a massacre. Roman soldiers who had waded a freezing river before breakfast, fought for hours in wet armor, and now found themselves surrounded on all sides, began to break. Not all of them. A corps of approximately 10,000 Roman soldiers, mostly the strongest, most experienced legionaries who had been in the center, managed to punch through Hannibal's weakened center line and escape northward toward the town of Placentia. They were the lucky ones. The rest, roughly 29,000 men, died on the banks of the Trebia or in the river itself. Men who had crossed that river that morning, chest deep in freezing water, thinking they were marching to victory. Many died trying to wade back across. The current took them. The cold finished what the Carthaginians had started. 29,000 Romans. One afternoon. Here is what those final hours actually felt like. You are a Roman legionary. You crossed that river at dawn. The cold so intense it felt like knives in your legs. By the time you reached the other bank, you couldn't feel your feet. You've been fighting for hours. Your shield arm is screaming. Your sword hand can barely grip. You hear screaming behind you. You turn and see Mago's troops pouring out of the reeds. You look left, cavalry. You look right, cavalry. You look forward, Hannibal's center, still holding despite everything. You understand in that moment with absolute clarity that you are going to die here. Some men threw down their weapons and ran for the river. The river killed many of them, hypothermia in the freezing December water, or simply swept away by the current in their armor. Some fought to the last. Some simply sat down in the mud and waited for it to end. The ancient sources say the bodies of Roman soldiers were found miles downstream, washed up on the banks of the Po. Men who had marched out that morning expecting to win. Hannibal's losses at Trebia were relatively light, perhaps 5,000 men, mostly the Gallic and Spanish troops in the center who had absorbed the Roman push. Several of his war elephants died, not from Roman weapons but from the cold. Animals bred in the warmth of North Africa, dying in the December chill of northern Italy. Hannibal himself reportedly suffered an eye infection during the campaign that would eventually cost him the sight in one eye. But he had won. More than one. He had destroyed the Second Roman army in a matter of weeks. Rome had now lost 2 consecutive battles against this man. And he was still deep inside Italian territory with no intention of leaving. The news reached Rome gradually. Not in one announcement. The Romans didn't have telegraph lines or radio. News traveled at the speed of a horse. First came rumors. Then came survivors stumbling into towns along the Po. Then came the official reports. The Senate convened. 29,000 dead. 2 consular armies badly damaged. Hannibal camped in northern Italy victorious, with the whole peninsula open before him. The response of the Roman Senate is one of the most remarkable things in military history. They did not panic. They did not negotiate. They did not consider surrender for even a moment. They raised more legions. They appointed commanders, reorganized their strategy, sent messages to their allies in Italy asking them to hold firm. And they prepared for the next battle. Because this is what Rome did. What Rome had always done. What Rome would do again at Lake Trasimene 6 months later, when Hannibal killed another 15,000 Romans in an ambush. What Rome would do again at Cannae in 216 BC, the single worst defeat in Roman history, 70,000 dead in a single day. Every time Rome raised more legions, kept fighting, refused to accept that losing meant losing. Hannibal won virtually every battle he fought in Italy. He spent 15 years on Italian soil, winning, brilliant, undefeated in the field, and he never took Rome, not because he couldn't march there. He could have, but because without siege equipment, without naval support, without resupply from Carthage, which the Carthaginian Senate consistently failed to provide, he couldn't break Rome's walls or Rome's will. He won all the battles, and lost the war. In 202 BC, 16 years after Trebia, Hannibal was recalled to North Africa to defend Carthage from a Roman invasion. He faced Scipio Africanus at the Battle of Zama, and lost. For the first time in his life, Hannibal went into exile, was eventually hunted across the Mediterranean by Roman agents, cornered in Bithynia in 183 BC, rather than be captured and displayed in a Roman triumph, paraded through the streets as a trophy. He took poison. He was 64 years old. Here is what Trebia actually tells us. Hannibal was the greatest battlefield commander of the ancient world. Possibly of any world. The double envelopment he perfected at Trebia, improved upon at Cannae 2 years later, is still studied in military academies today. But Trebia tells us something else. Tells us about the Roman soldier. 29,000 men died in that freezing river and on those muddy banks. They had been sent across that river before breakfast, in December, by an impatient consul who wanted his moment of glory. They had crossed anyway. They had fought for hours in wet armor, nearly frozen, increasingly surrounded. And the core of them, that 10,000 who punched through and escaped, they didn't run when the flanks collapsed. They pushed forward, through Hannibal's center, through everything. That is not strategy. That is something harder to explain. something Rome had in enormous quantities, something Hannibal, for all his genius, could never quite find a way to destroy. The Battle of Trebia should have ended Rome. 2 armies destroyed in 2 weeks. The greatest general in the ancient world loose in northern Italy. It didn't end Rome. It hardened Rome into something that would, 16 years later, produce the general who finally beat Hannibal at his own game. Scipio Africanus studied every battle Hannibal had ever fought. Trebia, Trasimene, Cannae. He learned from all of them. And at Zama, he used Hannibal's own tactics against him. The student of Hannibal's victories became the architect of Hannibal's only defeat. Here's what I want you to think about. Hannibal spent 15 years in Italy, won every battle, never lost, and still lost the war. Rome spent 15 years losing battles to the greatest general who ever lived, and still won. What does that tell you about the difference between winning battles and winning wars? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you want to see the battle where Hannibal perfected everything he learned at Trebia, where 70,000 Romans died in a single afternoon in the most tactically perfect battle in history, the Battle of Cannae is coming next.